similarly, I would again like to refer to Aleph Shafak's 40 Rules of Love, which is a postmodern piece, yet you see that there's this story of Shams and Tabriz picked up in a very, in a very contemporary setting. So this is actually called as Vestige, or celebration of old ideas in new work, and many writers from contemporary literature have practiced it. Now we move on to another feature, that is the strong characters. This is pretty simple to understand through an example of Shakespearean dramas. If you look at the Shakespearean dramas, we see that most of the characters are actually plot driven. For example, Hamlet. Hamlet is one of the famous literary piece by Shakespeare, where we see that Hamlet is actually a victim of his fate, and this trend is continuously observed in all of the old literature that we read. But contrary to this, if we read the contemporary literature, we see that mm, the characters are very strong, and all of the stories in the contemporary literature are actually character driven. You may take an example of Paulo Coelho's Alchemist, which is one of the very famous literary piece these days. And we see that the main character struggles through life, and he passes through different incidents, and in the end he is able to achieve his destination. Let me make it clear here, the presence of strong character does not mean that he actually wins, or he actually achieves his destination in the end. Rather, it is to say that even if any character fails in the end, he is not actually driven by the plot. Rather, the plot is driven by the characters in contemporary literature. Moving on to the next feature, it says based on mini narratives. For understanding mini narratives, first we have to understand what are grand narratives. Grand narratives are the bigger issues, or the bigger problems of the world that have been repeatedly discussed in literature, or in form of any other art, or that have been politically discussed widely by different people. So what can these grand narratives be? They may be focusing on social injustice, they may be focusing on social discrimination. For instance, you may take example of Goethe's Faust here. We read Faust, and we saw that there is this man who is fighting a struggle of achieving satisfaction, which can only be achieved, according to writer's perspective, it can only be achieved through submission to God. So it was one of the grand narrative of the time, that there is always a struggle between good and evil, and in the end whoever does good wins. Contrary to this, if we see that how the contemporary writers project the idea, they pick up mini narratives. You may not say that they change the problems. Maybe they're talking about the same problems that people are facing, but they present them through a lens of ordinary human being. For example, you may pick up the example, you may understand this through the example of Arundhati Roy's The Ministry of Utmost Happiness, which is a story of a homosexual who is struggling different wars. And within that story, Arundhati Roy has presented the political upheaval as well. She has written so much about what is happening in the world, but she has not picked up a grand narrative. Rather, she is seeing all that, or presenting all that through the lens of a homosexual, or a mayor, who doesn't have the human rights which he deserves. The next feature that we're going to discuss is disillusion boundaries of right and wrong. So this can be truly understood if we refer to the Canterbury Tales, for example, of Geoffrey Chaucer, where there was a clear distinction between what is right and what is wrong. Even if he is being sarcastic, and he has sarcastically or ironically projected a few of his characters in the Canterbury Tales, yet we see that he clearly mentions that they are the wrongdoers. But nowadays, stories are written with a perspective where the interpretation is solely upon the reader, and the reader has to decide whether what is right and wrong. So it means that right and wrong are the relative terms, and a few things for modern people can be, or postmodern people can be wrong in one situation, and the same thing can be right in another situation. This may be understood with reference to Kite Runner's main character Amir, who witnesses his half brother being raped, but he doesn't take an action. But till the end, the writer does not give any perspective. Rather, he just claims that the Amir is struggling with his guilt. But the way Amir is being projected in front of the readers is with the blurred boundaries of right and wrong. It does not give a clear idea that is Amir to be blamed or not. Um, Rather, a reader over the course of period may develop a kind of sympathy with Amir, despite he being wrong. So this is one of the feature of contemporary literature. The next feature that we see here on the screen is globalization, which is pretty easy to understand. For example, globalization actually refers to mixing of cultures, language, religious beliefs. Now, if we compare it with the old literature, we may clearly understand that prior to this time, there were lesser chances of people to communicate with each other or have a kind of cultural exchange. They were confined to their own boundaries and territories. Now there's a lot of communication between people across borders, and that is why they have exchange of ideas and they may explore things. And similar has an impact, all this has an impact upon literature. So we see there is this mix of Western and Eastern culture in a lot of contemporary literature. For example, if you pick up a Pakistani writer, Umaira Ahmad, you're going to see that her writing is mostly bilingual, which is an evidence of globalization in literature. Then we move to the next feature, which is immigrant experience. This can be understood in the sense that even till the last few centuries, we did not have the open land routes, or even the that much of communication through air or land routes, which we have to the extent we have it now in the postmodern world. And that is why anyone who wants to have an immigrant experience, or maybe anyone who is a writer, definitely can bring in a traveling experience into the writing. So we see that contemporary literature has this impact of immigrant experience. This again is present in Kite Runner, where the main characters of the novel move from one place to the other, and they compare how had they been living in their own country and how they suffered you know uh, from uh, a lot of issues that they faced after immigration. So we see that there has been much about immigrant experience in the contemporary literature. The last feature that we have of the postmodern literature is not very new to express, although the theory in itself might be new, as it has been proposed by Ferdinand de Saussure recently. And it is one of the linguistic theory where he says that things can actually be understood when they are presented with reference to their opposites. For example, good and bad, light and dark, or let me explain it more clearly, that anyone may be able to understand the presence of evil in absence of good. you may understand evil in a better way in absence of good. So the absence of one entity makes the presence of the other clearer. So we're going to we may incorporate this presence of good and bad, or maybe good and evil. We may understand it through Harry Potter, J.K. Rowling's Harry Potter, where there is this child who is fighting against evil in the magical world. This is not at all a new idea, but this has been explored with a new perspective of binary oppositions in the postmodern literature. Hope this